She didn't beg. That's what they never expected from a woman like Luna Everly. A woman who had bled for a kingdom that handed her Echo like a gift. They thought betrayal would break her. They thought she'd crumble the moment the crown was stripped from her hands and the palace gates slammed shut behind her. They were wrong. Because the most dangerous thing in any empire isn't the alpha who sits the throne. It's the woman they were stupid enough to throw away. Stay until the end. Drop a like and tell me, what city are you watching from tonight? Let your people know you're here. The lanterns went up at dusk. Thousands of them, bone white and gold, rising from the hands of the court's servants in long practice columns, until the sky above Draven's Keep looked like something burning slow and beautiful. Luna Everly stood at the upper balcony of the eastern tower and watched them climb, and she didn't feel anything she was supposed to feel. She should have felt pride. 6 years she'd helped design this festival. The routing of the lantern processions, the placement of the fire pits along the outer walls, the negotiation with 3 border packs to ensure their chiefs attended as guests rather than threats. 6 years of architecture built from patience and compromise and the specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't show on your face because you learned very young that showing it was a vulnerability you couldn't afford. She pressed 2 fingers against the stone balustrade. Cold. Even in late summer, the keep stone held winter in its bones, and she'd never gotten used to it, not in 6 years of calling this place home. Below in the main courtyard, the nobles were already assembling. She could pick them out by their colors. The Whitecrest delegation in silver, the Blackfin chiefs in their dark furs, the Ironhold merchants, who weren't supposed to be here at all but had sent representatives anyway because nobody turned down an invitation to the Moon Festival and expected to do business in this kingdom afterward. Hundreds of bodies, hundreds of calculations. Every alliance in that courtyard had a fracture point, and Everly knew where each one was because she had spent years memorizing them. That was the job. Not the crown, not the title. The job was knowing which fractures to leave alone and which to press before they opened on their own. She heard the door behind her. She didn't turn around. "You're not dressed," said the voice of Marin Voss, her head attendant, a sharp-boned woman of 50 who had survived 3 Alpha Queens before Everly and wore that survival like armor. "I'm dressed." "You're in a riding shirt." "Then I'm partially dressed." Marin came to stand beside her at the balustrade. She looked down at the courtyard, and her silence had a texture to it, the specific kind that meant she was choosing words carefully. "The Alpha King arrived from the War Hall an hour ago," Marin said. "He hasn't asked for you. He rarely does." "Everly." "I know." She finally turned from the balustrade. "I know, Marin. Give me 10 minutes." The gown they'd prepared was deep blue, the color of the sky the moment before it committed fully to night. It had been chosen 6 weeks ago when the festival planning was still running smooth, when Everly had still been operating under the assumption that the state of her marriage was a private collapse, something she could manage, something she could keep contained the way she contained everything else. She'd been wrong about that too. She stood still while Marin worked the closures at her back. Her reflection watched her from the bronze mirror across the room, a woman of 31 with dark eyes and a face that had learned composure the way other people learned languages, through repetition and consequence. There was a mark at her left temple, barely visible, a scar from the border skirmish 2 years ago when a rogue beta had broken through their eastern line and Everly had been in the wrong corridor at the wrong moment. Kael had never asked how she got it. "The Aldrich girl is here," Marin said. Her voice stayed careful, level. Everly's hands stilled against her sides. "Which Aldrich girl?" Marin didn't answer, and that was answer enough. Sarah Aldrich. Daughter of Alpha Rowan Aldrich of the Thornridge Pack, which controlled the southeastern trade passes that Draven's Keep had been trying to negotiate access through for 3 years. 23 years old, amber-eyed, the kind of beautiful that red is weaponized even when it wasn't trying to be, which in Everly's experience meant it usually was. Everly had known about Sarah Aldrich for 4 months. She had known the way you know about a wound that hasn't fully declared itself yet. Through peripheral evidence, through the changed temperature in a room when certain names were spoken, through the specific quality of absence when Kael returned from diplomatic meetings 2 hours later than he should have and didn't explain and didn't have to, because Alpha Kings didn't explain themselves to anyone. She had said nothing. She had calculated. A Luna who moved against her husband's mistress before she had proof was a Luna who lost. A Luna who moved with proof, at the right moment, before the right audience. That was something else entirely. "Finish the back," Everly said. Marin finished it. What? The Moon Festival opened with the traditional fire lighting, the Alpha King himself descending from the main hall to touch flame to the great iron bowl at the courtyard's center, a gesture that dated back to the founding wars and meant something about continuity, about the bloodline of Draven holding the kingdom's warmth against the dark. Everly had read the history 3 times because knowing the history was part of the job. She watched Kael cross the courtyard from the far side of the balcony above, and she made herself look at him the way she used to look at problems. With clarity, without flinching. He was a physically enormous man, Alpha Kael Draven, built like something the land itself had made rather than any human womb. 6'4", shoulders that filled a war coat, dark hair going gray at the temples now at 38, in a way that had only made him look more settled into his authority. When he moved, the crowd adjusted around him without even seeming to notice it was doing so. That was the pull of a dominant alpha, the gravitational quality that was less charisma than it was pure biological signal. And for a long time, a younger version of Everly had felt it the same way everyone else did. She didn't feel it now. What she felt was watchful. He lit the fire. The crowd responded with the expected sounds, the deep collective exhale, the striking of the festival drums beginning their low processional rhythm. Kael raised his head and looked across the courtyard, and for a moment Everly thought he was looking for her. He wasn't. His eyes found Sarah Aldrich where she stood with the Thornridge delegation, and even across that distance, even with 200 people between them, the look was visible to anyone paying close enough attention. Everly had been paying attention for months. She went downstairs. The festival floor moved the way court events always moved, in concentric circles of importance, the inner ring being direct blood and alliance, the outer rings being ambassadors and merchants and the ambitious. Everly moved through it the way she always had, stopping where she needed to stop, saying precisely what each conversation required and nothing beyond it. She had a gift for this that she'd never once received credit for because it looked effortless, and things that looked effortless didn't register as labor. Chief Aldous Wren of the Northern Greywood Pack stopped her near the fire bowl. He was an older man, thick-necked and cautious, the kind of leader whose skepticism was a survival trait rather than a personality defect. "Luna Everly," he said, "I didn't think you'd bother with us small folk tonight, given the delegation from the south." "The Greywood Pack is not small folk, Chief Wren. You control the northern timber routes. Every palisade in this kingdom is built with your trees." He smiled, the particular satisfied smile of a man who was used to being an afterthought and wasn't used to being told otherwise. "Your husband doesn't seem to know that." "My husband is managing many things tonight. I manage the things he doesn't." She kept her voice even, light. "The Eastern Timber contract expires at the month's end. I'd like your representative to sit with my trade council before you leave." "You have authority on trade contracts now?" "I've had authority on trade contracts for 2 years, Chief Wren. The signature was always Kael's. The work was always mine." He considered her. There was something in his expression that hovered between respect and pity, and she liked the respect and had no use for the pity, but she understood both. "I'll send my man," he said. She moved on. She found Counselor Drast near the wine tables, which was where Counselor Drast usually could be found when there was something he didn't want to discuss directly. He used crowds the way other men used offices, as a buffer. Harlow Drast was the oldest member of Kael's inner council, 60 years old, with a face like weathered hide and eyes that had learned to give nothing away. He had been on the council before Kael took the throne, before Kael's father even. That kind of tenure either meant you were invaluable or you were very good at surviving. Everly had never been certain which was true of Drast. "Counselor," she said. "Luna." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You're working tonight." "I'm always working." "Yes," he said, and something behind his eyes shifted. "I've noticed that." It was a strange thing to say. The way he said it was stranger. Everly filed it without reacting. "The Aldrich delegation," she said. "How long have they been in contact with the War Council?" Drast's cup didn't move. "The Alpha King manages his alliances as he sees fit." "I'm asking about contact with the War Council specifically, not the Alpha King." A pause. Small. The length of a breath held and released. "You should enjoy the festival, Luna Everly," Drast said. "It's a beautiful night." He moved away from her. She stood there for a moment with the fire at her back and the sound of the drums in her chest, and she turned over what he hadn't said. Drast had been on the council before Kael. He knew where bodies were buried in this kingdom, the way cartographers knew rivers. Not because he put them there, but because he'd watched long enough to map the terrain. She had just told him she was looking, and he had not told her she was wrong. Thus, she found the evidence she'd been waiting for in the East correspondence room at the quarter hour past the festival's second bell. It hadn't been difficult. Kael's private secretary, a young beta named Torvin, who was loyal to the crown in the abstract but susceptible to the very human conviction that information shared with the Luna was information shared with the throne, had let something slip 3 weeks ago about a sealed courier run from Thornridge. Everly had not pressed. She had waited and watched, and this evening, when the festival drew Torvin to the courtyard with everyone else, she had walked into the correspondence room with the calmness of a woman who belonged there, which she did, because she was still the Luna, and that title still opened doors regardless of what was rotting behind them. The letters were not hidden well. They were folded inside a trade document, which meant someone had assumed they would be indistinguishable from legitimate correspondence, which meant someone had underestimated her. She read them standing up. Her face didn't change. There were 6 letters. 3 from Sarah Aldrich, written in the formal style of political correspondence, but with undertones that no legitimate political correspondence required. 2 from Alpha Rowan Aldrich himself, careful, measured, but unmistakable in their intent. The territory transfer they were proposing wasn't diplomatic. It was structural. They were offering Kael a consolidation of southeastern power in exchange for the dissolution of his current bond pairing and a formal alliance through Sarah, which was language for marriage, which was language for making Everly's bloodline, her territorial rights, and her 6 years of work disappear through a legal mechanism that would look, from the outside, like a political upgrade. The 6th letter was in Kael's handwriting. She read it twice. She put it back exactly where she found it. For a long time she stood in the empty correspondence room with the distant sound of drums and celebration coming through the stone walls, and she had a conversation with herself that she would never tell anyone about, because it was not the kind of conversation you shared. It was the kind you had alone, in a cold room, when the thing you'd been half preparing for finally arrived, and you had to decide what you actually were. She could leave, walk out the eastern gate tonight with what she knew, find sanctuary with the Greywood Pack or the Ironhold territories, build something new on ground that didn't have 6 years of her blood in the mortar. It would be survivable. She had skills, and she had contacts, and she was not, despite what the comfort of the last 6 years might have suggested, someone who needed a palace to have power, or she could use what she had, right now, tonight, in front of the only audience that mattered. She straightened her gown. She checked her reflection in the dark glass of the room's single window, a woman whose face told you nothing unless she wanted it to. She went back to the festival. She timed it to the 3rd bell, when the formal presentations began. This was the moment in the evening structure when the Alpha King and Luna took their positions at the central dais and the assembled court paid formal acknowledgement, the chiefs presenting their tokens, the ambassadors stating their greetings, the whole choreography of hierarchy made visible through ritual. Kael was already at the dais when she arrived. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for the past year, with the faint, distracted courtesy of a man who has already moved his attention elsewhere but hasn't yet found an exit from the room. "You're late," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "I was reading," she said. He didn't ask what. He looked back at the assembled court. The presentations moved through their expected order. Everly stood beside Kael and spoke when spoken to and smiled when the moment required it. and she breathed evenly, and she watched the Thornridge delegation where they stood in the third ring. Sarah Aldrich in pale gold, positioned with the specific casualness of someone who has practiced being casually positioned. The girl caught her looking and didn't look away. That told Everly everything she needed to know about how much preparation had gone into tonight from that direction. She waited for the presentations to finish. She waited for the exact moment when the formality dissolved back into celebration and the court exhaled into music and wine and the natural loosening of an evening moving toward its middle hours. Then she spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had spent 6 years learning how to make a room go quiet when she chose to make it go quiet. Before we continue, Everly said, the drums didn't stop immediately, but the human layer of the crowd stilled. Kyle turned to look at her, something shifting behind his eyes. A first flicker of awareness, of wrongness, of the specific animal sense that something was about to happen that you cannot prevent. I'd like to acknowledge our guests from Thornridge, Everly said. Alpha Rowan Aldrich has been very generous in his correspondence with this court. Very thorough. The silence spread. The drums stopped. Luna Everly. Kale's voice was flat, warning. I've been reading, she said again. She looked out at the court rather than at him. The Alpha King's correspondence specifically, with Alpha Aldrich. Regarding the terms of a proposed new alliance, the dissolution of existing bloodline bonds, and the formal transfer of my territorial inheritance, which, I should clarify for anyone unfamiliar with our covenant structure, cannot be transferred without my explicit consent, which I have not given, which was not asked for. The courtyard had gone so quiet she could hear the fire. Enough! Kale stepped toward her, one sharp move. His voice had dropped into the register that made lesser wolves flinch. It didn't make Everly flinch. Sarah Aldrich. She said the name clearly. She watched the girl's face do the thing faces do when exposure arrives, the microsecond of calculation, of recalibration, before the features reassembled into something controlled. I'd like to ask her, in front of this court, whether she was aware that the agreement she and her father proposed required my removal. Not my cooperation. My removal. I said enough. Kale's hand closed on her arm. She looked down at it. She looked up at him. And this was the thing she had been steeling herself for. Because she had loved him once. She genuinely had. And loving something and losing it and watching it become something else entirely was not a clean wound. It was the kind that went on bleeding in ways you didn't always notice. Let go of my arm, she said quietly. You will stop speaking, now. Or what? She said it without heat, like a question that actually wanted an answer. You'll remove me? You were already planning to. The court was not breathing. Kale's grip tightened. His eyes were dark with something that might have been rage or might have been something worse. The specific look of a man who has been caught and whose first instinct is to make the person who caught him pay for it. You have humiliated this court, he said. You humiliated this court, Everly said. I just said it out loud. She saw it coming. She read it in his body the way you read weather in the sky. The gathering pressure. The quality of stillness before the motion. She had time to know it was happening and no time to change it. Kyle's voice went flat and absolute, the voice of command, the voice that had ended border disputes and broken lesser alphas down to their knees. Luna Everly, he said, and even speaking the title, his tone stripped it of meaning. By the authority of the Draven seat, and before every witness in this court, your title is suspended. You will leave this palace before sunrise. The courtyard held its breath. Everly looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 6 years. She thought about the scar at her temple and the northern timber contracts, and the 3 border packs she'd kept from open war through 2 years of negotiations that she'd run herself because no one else had. She thought about the cold stone of the corridor outside the correspondence room and the letter in Kyle's own handwriting and what it had said. She didn't cry. She had known herself long enough to know she wouldn't. Fine, she said. She turned and walked off the dais. The crowd parted without being asked. She kept her head level and her hands still at her sides, and she walked through the moon festival that she had planned and across the courtyard that she had helped fortify and through the great doors of Draven's Keep and she did not look back. She left before sunrise the way he'd ordered because she had learned that the worst thing you could do was give your enemies the satisfaction of watching you refuse to comply when compliance was the smarter move. Marin packed 2 saddlebags without being asked. Old woman, sharp bones, 6 years of understanding what Everly was and what she was worth. "Where will you go?" Marin asked. "East first, then I'll see. The outer territories are dangerous, rogues, exiles. I know what they are." Everly buckled the second saddlebag herself. "I've spent 6 years negotiating with their chiefs. Most of them owe me something." Marin was quiet. Then, "He's going to regret this." "He already does," Everly said. "He just doesn't know it's regret. He thinks it's anger." She rode out through the postern gate, the small one on the eastern wall that wasn't watched as closely as the main passage, because it was considered an exit for servants and supplies, which was the kind of thing you knew when you'd spent 6 years learning the bones of a place. The sky was the flat gray of earliest morning, not yet committed to dawn. The festival lanterns had burned down to nothing. Somewhere behind her, the keep was still processing what had happened. The whisper networks running hot, the council members triangulating, the Aldrich delegation calculating whether this had gone according to plan or better than plan. She didn't think about that. She thought about the road. The outer territories began where the kingdom's maintained paths ended, a hard boundary marked not by walls but by the quality of the silence. The forest closed in. The road surface went from packed earth to something more suggestion than infrastructure. Everly rode through it with her spine straight and her eyes moving, reading the tree line the way Kael had once taught her to, back in the early years when he'd still been someone who taught her things. She made the first shelter by mid-morning. A way station, technically abandoned, but she'd had it stocked 6 months ago under a supply order that ran through the Eastern agricultural ledgers and would not be connected to her name by anyone looking at it quickly. She hadn't been planning for exile specifically. She'd been planning for contingency. There was a difference, and the difference was that a contingency plan doesn't assume the worst. It just doesn't rule it out. She was unsaddling her horse when the arrow came through the way station's open window and buried itself in the post 3 inches from her head. She went still. Then she went low, moving without thinking, 6 years of court polish dropping off her like water. Underneath it, something older and harder that had kept her alive through the border skirmish 2 years ago, and the political ambush before that, and a dozen smaller moments that no one wrote down in the histories. She pulled the way station door shut. She pressed her back against the interior wall and listened. 3 of them, she thought, moving through the north side of the tree line, weighted step, group pacing, the particular rhythm of people trying to be quiet, who had not practiced being quiet enough. Her hand went to the blade at her hip. Short, functional, not ceremonial. Another contingency she'd stopped apologizing for. The door burst open. The first man through it was big, rogue-built, the kind of lean that came from hunger rather than training. He had a Draven patrol insignia on his shoulder that had been scratched out but not removed completely, which told her he'd either stolen it or been dismissed recently enough that he hadn't thought to get rid of it. Behind him, 2 more, all armed, all looking at her with the particular expression of people who had been told this would be easy. "Luna Everly," the first one said, making the title sound like a joke. "Former Luna. The Alpha Kings posted a retrieval order. Says you left without completing the formal separation process." She looked at the 3 of them. She looked at the distance to the door. She looked at what she had and what she didn't have, and she did the math the way she always did the math. Fast, clear, without sentiment. "A retrieval order," she said. "He sent 3 men. He sent us." "He sent 3 men," she said again, and something in her voice made the first man's expression flicker. "After publicly stripping my title in front of 200 witnesses. After I walked out of that courtyard without making a scene." She tilted her head. "Does that sound like someone you retrieve? Or does it sound like someone Kael Draven is afraid of?" The first man moved toward her. She let him get close enough that the distance collapsed to nothing, and then she moved. Not the way she'd been trained to move in the court's defensive seminars, which were theoretical exercises designed to make noble women feel capable, but the way she'd learned to move in the 2 years after the border skirmish when she'd quietly hired a Blackfen trainer and told no one. She hit the retrieval order's leg at the joint and let physics do the rest, and he went down harder than he'd planned. The blade came out. She put it where it needed to be. Not killing, because she wasn't there yet, because there might still be a world where she didn't need to be there, just enough that the other two reassessed. They did. The second man was reaching for his weapon when the door behind him opened from outside. A woman stepped through it. Everly had never seen her before. That alone was notable. Everly had spent 6 years building a mental catalog of everyone who moved through these territories, and this woman was not in it. She was roughly 40, dark-skinned, built like someone who had lived outdoors for years and had made peace with it. She had a short blade in each hand and the specific quality of relaxation that very competent people have when they're doing something they're good at. She looked at the 3 retrieval men. She looked at Everly with the blade still out. "Dravens?" she asked. "Apparently." The woman's gaze moved back to the men. "You picked the wrong Luna to follow." It went quickly after that, the kind of quickly that Everly recognized as practiced. The woman moved like a fighter who had been fighting for practical stakes for a very long time, and when it was done, the 3 men were alive and would stay that way, which said something about the woman's economy of violence. She didn't waste energy on permanence when temporary would do. Everly looked at her across the wreckage of the encounter. "Who are you?" she said. The woman cleaned her blades with a cloth from her belt. She had the deliberate patience of someone who answered questions when she was ready to answer them and not before. "My name is Calla Vane," she said. "I run a coalition out of the Ashwood territories. We've been watching Draven's Keep get worse for about 2 years now. Council rot, border pressure, the Alpha King spending more time managing his bedroom politics than his kingdom." She looked up. "We've been waiting for someone on the inside to either fix it or break." "It broke," Everly said. "You broke it," Calla said, "which is different." Everly absorbed that. Outside, the forest was morning quiet, birdsong and wind, the absolute indifference of the natural world to human collapse. "What do you want from me?" she said. Calla looked at her steadily. "The outer territories have 11 coalition packs who have been waiting 3 years for Draven's Keep to implode. When it does, and it will, because what we know about the council corruption is worse than what you know, those packs are going to need someone to organize them." She paused. "Someone the border chiefs already respect. Someone who understands how the kingdom actually works from the inside." "And you think that's me?" "I think that's you," Calla said. "I think Kael Draven just threw away the most valuable thing in his kingdom and called it punishment." Everly looked at her hands, still steady. Good. She was calculating distances again. Not physical ones this time. The distance between what she'd been and what she might need to become. The distance between the Luna who managed things from inside the palace and whatever she would be required to be out here. "You said the council corruption is worse than what I know," she said. "Much worse." "Tell me." Calla opened her mouth to speak, and the sound of hoofbeats came through the trees. Not 3 riders. More. Coming fast. Calla moved to the window. Her expression changed in a way that didn't suggest fear exactly, but something adjacent. The face of a person who has just had a calculation disrupted. "They didn't send 3 men," Calla said. "The 3 men were the first wave." Everly looked at the window, looked at the door, looked at Calla. "How many?" Calla turned from the window. "Enough that we cannot fight them," she said. "Enough that Kael Draven did not send retrieval orders. He sent something else entirely." The hoofbeats weren't slowing. Everly moved to the window beside Calla and looked through the gap in the shutter without touching it. Old reflex, the kind you developed when you learned that silhouettes in windows were targets. Through the tree line, she could make out movement, the kind that wasn't subtle because it wasn't trying to be. Mounted, armed, moving in a spread pattern that wasn't retrieval formation. It was a sweep. "How many exits does this way station have?" Calla asked. 2. The door we came through and a hatch in the floor that drops into a supply channel running west. Calla looked at her. The look was brief and assessing and not entirely surprised, which told Everly the woman had already done some version of this calculation. "You stalked this place," Calla said. It wasn't a question. 6 months ago. before the festival, before a lot of things. The hoofbeats were close enough now that she could feel them in the soles of her feet through the plank floor. The 3 men she'd disarmed were still on the ground, one unconscious, 2 sullen and wrist-tied with strips from a bridle she'd found hanging by the door. Neither of them was going to be useful for information in the next 90 seconds, and she didn't have 90 seconds. "West Channel," she said. "Go." Calla didn't argue. That alone was worth noting. A woman who moved when the information was good and didn't spend time questioning the source. In Everly's experience, that was rarer than it should have been. The hatch was under the straw on the eastern side of the floor, which was counterintuitive enough that whoever had built it had probably been proud of the detail. Everly lifted it without ceremony. The channel below was low and dark and smelled of old water and earth, and she went into it first because it was her contingency, and that meant she owned the risk. They moved through the channel at a crouch for what felt like 300 meters, but was probably less. Calla made almost no sound. The hoofbeats above them became voices, became boots on the way station floor, became muffled shouting that Everly cataloged and filed without stopping to process it yet, because processing was a luxury and she wasn't in a position for luxuries. The channel opened into a shallow drainage culvert that ran along the edge of a dry creek bed. Gray morning sky above. Tree cover. Adequate. No horses on their side of it. Everly came up out of the culvert and stood in the creek bed and listened to everything at once. Wind direction, bird noise, the distant shouting reorganizing itself into search patterns. "They'll find the channel," she said. "How long?" 20 minutes. Less if they have a good tracker. She looked west. The tree line was thick in that direction, the ashwood beginning properly about a kilometer out. "You said your coalition runs out of the ashwood." "Eastern ashwood. 2 hours on foot from here." Calla was already moving. "Faster if you know the paths." "Do you know them?" "I made them." They moved. Everly was not unfit. 6 years of court life hadn't softened her the way it softened some Lunas who mistook the role for a ceremonial one. She had walked borderlines and ridden patrol routes and done it alongside the people doing the actual work rather than observing it from a comfortable distance. But 2 hours through the Ashwood's eastern approach was terrain that had opinions about being crossed, and by the time Calla's coalition camp came into view, through the trees Everly's shoulder was aching where she'd taken the door handle during the way station fight, and she had a cut on her left hand she hadn't noticed acquiring. The camp was not what she'd expected. She'd been carrying a mental image built from every rogue encampment she'd seen in official reports. Disorganized, desperate, the particular squalor of people living outside the kingdom's structures without having planned for it. What she found instead was something that had been built with intention. 40 or 50 people by quick count, a mix of ages and sizes that suggested genuine community rather than a raiding band. Structures that were temporary but not makeshift. A perimeter that had been thought through. Several people came to their feet when she and Calla emerged from the tree line. The attention was immediate and pointed. "Stand down," Calla said, not loudly. It worked. A man approached from the center of the camp. He was roughly Everly's age, broad through the chest, with a jaw that had been broken at some point and healed slightly off-center. He looked at Calla first, and then at Everly with the kind of assessment that didn't pretend to be anything else. "Draven's patrols are in the eastern corridor," he said to Calla. "We had to pull Yen and the others back." "I know. They found us at the way station." Calla gestured toward Everly without elaborating. "This is who we went to collect." "I'm aware of who she is," the man said. He looked at Everly directly. "I'm Bram. I run the camp logistics." A beat. "You're smaller than I expected." "You're saying that like it changes your assessment," Everly said. "It shouldn't." Bram's mouth moved in something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." They gave her water and a place to sit that wasn't the ground, and Calla pulled Bram aside while Everly cleaned the cut on her hand with the supplies someone wordlessly placed beside her. She worked through it methodically, the way she worked through most things, present, precise, not spending emotional energy on what she couldn't use right now. Around her the camp moved. People cooked, maintained, argued in low voices. A girl of maybe 12 was fletching arrows with the focused expression of someone who had been doing it long enough to find it meditative. An old man sharpened a blade on a stone with the patient rhythm of a person who understood that the quality of the edge was the difference between situations. Nobody performed for her. Nobody avoided her. They absorbed her presence the way a functional group absorbed new variables, with watchful neutrality. She had worked hard, in 6 years of court life, to be the kind of Luna who was genuinely useful rather than ornamental. She had done it because it was the right strategy, and because there was a part of her that couldn't have done it any other way. Sitting in this camp, watching people who had built something real in genuinely difficult conditions, she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for, adjacent to recognition. Calla came back without Bram. "The patrol that hit the way station," she said, settling across from Everly. "They weren't retrieval. They were erasure." Everly's hands stilled on the bandage she was winding. "Say that plainly." "The order came from the Keep's War Council, not from Kyle Draven directly." Calla held her gaze. "Or if it came from him, it came from a version of him that's been operating on information someone else curated. The Council has been feeding him bad intelligence. For months. Longer, maybe." Calla's voice didn't soften the information. "There are 2 council members, Drast and a younger one named Farron, who have been in correspondence with the Aldrich Pack since before the festival. What Sarah Aldrich was doing wasn't just competing for an alpha's attention, it was an insertion. She was placed there to accelerate Kael's isolation from anyone who could correct his picture of what was happening in the kingdom." Everly absorbed this. She thought about Drast at the wine table, the strange weight in his words. "You should enjoy the festival." She thought about what it meant that he'd warned her without warning her, the specific moral compromise of a man who had decided he was too old to stop what was happening, but too human to pretend he didn't see it. "The coup isn't coming," she said. "It's already in motion." "It's been in motion for 8 months. Calla leaned forward. "The Aldrich Pack doesn't want the kingdom's trade routes. They want the bloodline territories. Your bloodline specifically. The eastern corridor that came with your bond pairing. It's the only land bridge between Thornridge and the northern packs they're trying to consolidate. Without it, their expansion stalls. With it, they control the entire eastern seaboard supply chain." The eastern corridor. 300 kilometers of managed territory that Everly had inherited from her mother's line. Old land, old agreements, the kind of asset that didn't show up in the annual ledgers as a number but functioned as the circulatory system of half the kingdom's trade. She had known they wanted it. She hadn't known they were willing to burn the keep to get it. "And Kael," she said. "What do they do with Kael when they've finished using him?" Calla's expression didn't move. "Ah," Everly said. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the edge of the camp where the tree line began, and she let herself have the grief she hadn't had time for yet. Not the performative kind, not the kind that needed an audience, but the real and difficult kind that came from understanding that a man she had chosen and worked beside and in some form still carried in her chest had been so thoroughly deceived that he had sentenced her to death while thinking he was punishing her for pride. That was the thing about manipulation at that scale. It didn't just corrupt the corrupted. It made the corrupted into instruments, and the instruments did the damage, and the people who engineered it got to stand at a distance and call it natural consequence. She was not going to cry about Kael Draven, but she let herself acknowledge that there was something to grieve. Not the man he'd become in the last year, but the possibility of the man he might have been if someone hadn't spent 8 months carefully closing every window. She filed it. She moved on. By the time the camp's early risers began moving at first light, she had a rough map drawn in the dirt in front of her. Not the kingdom's official cartography, but her own working version, built from 6 years of knowing where things actually were versus where they appeared on paper. She looked at it until Calla came to stand beside her. "You didn't sleep," Calla said. "I was working." Calla looked at the dirt map. She was quiet for a moment, reading it. "The Ironhold Pass," she said, touching a point on the map's eastern edge. "If the Aldrich Pack moves to close the corridor, they'll need to control the Ironhold Passage first. It's the only viable military route that doesn't require crossing river terrain in late summer." Everly looked up. "Do you have anyone in Ironhold?" I have one contact, a merchant who runs information when the price is right. Get them a message. I need to know if there's been any unusual supply movement through that pass in the last 30 days. Kala's head tilted, just slightly. You think they're already staging? I think if they sent an erasure team after me the morning after the festival, they've been ready to move for longer than 8 months. The festival was a trigger, not a cause. Everly looked back at the map. Kale stripping my title publicly gave them a gift. It looks like legitimate political consequence. It obscures the fact that what's about to happen was never about me. Bram won't like bringing you into operational planning, Kala said. Not as a warning, as a statement of fact, delivered in the tone of someone who was deciding how much she cared about that. Bram doesn't have to like it. Everly smoothed the dirt map flat with one hand. Ask him if he'd rather have the operational planning or not. Kala studied her for a moment, then, the 11 coalition packs I mentioned, 2 of them are a hard no on anything that looks like backing a Draven agenda. They've been burned by keep politics before, and they're not interested in being used as proxies in a civil dispute. This isn't a civil dispute. Everly met her eyes. A civil dispute is when 2 factions of a kingdom argue about who runs it. What's coming is an external actor using internal rot to collapse the whole structure. Those 2 packs don't need to back a Draven agenda. They need to back their own survival. The silence between them was the productive kind. The kind where the other person is not resisting you, but converting. I'll arrange the meeting, Kala said. She met Bram properly that evening, over a fire and a meal that was plain and adequate and shared without ceremony, which she understood as a test she wasn't supposed to notice she was being given. He ate the way men ate who had spent time in the field, efficiently, without conversation until the food was handled. She matched the pace without comment. When the meal was finished, he poured 2 cups of something that was not wine and pushed one toward her. You're going to tell me what you want from the coalition, he said, because Kala will give it to you if you ask in the right way, and I'd rather hear your version before she decides I've already agreed. I want information access and a courier route. I want to know when the Aldrich pack moves on Ironhold, and I want to be present when Kala meets with the 11 packs. That's a lot of want for someone who showed up here this morning running from a kill order. I showed up here this morning because someone set up a contact in advance, Everly said. Kala didn't find me by accident. Someone at the keep or close to it has been in communication with your network for longer than I've been exiled. I'd like to know who. Bram's jaw worked. He looked at her over his cup. You're not asking to join us, he said. No. You're asking us to join you. I'm asking you to recognize that what happens to this kingdom in the next 30 days will reach these territories whether you engage with it or not. Passive survival is still a choice, and it's a choice with costs. She held his gaze. The difference is whether you make it from the outside looking in or from a position where you've shaped the terrain. He was quiet for a long time. The contact at the keep, he finally said. It wasn't someone on Kael's side. He paused. It was someone on the council who realized 6 weeks ago that what they'd allowed to happen couldn't be stopped from the inside. Everly went very still. Drast, she said. Bram didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. She thought about the old man at the wine table, the careful warning shaped like a pleasantry. The wait behind you should enjoy the festival. She thought about a man who had survived 3 Alpha Kings by knowing when things were moving past the point of correction, and what it cost him to reach outside the walls he'd spent a lifetime inside. He's still in the keep, she said. He was, as of 4 days ago. If the Aldrich faction knows he reached out, then he's already dead or close to it, Bram said. Yes. She sat with that. The fire moved. Somewhere in the camp someone laughed. Sudden, unguarded, the laugh of a person who had forgotten for a moment where they were, which was the kind of thing that happened in real communities and didn't happen in frightened ones. I need a rider to Ironhold tonight, she said, and I need a message sent to the Northern Greywood Pack through your network. She set down her cup. Chief Wren owes me a timber contract negotiation. He's going to owe me something considerably larger before this is finished. Bram looked at her for a long moment. Kala said you were worth the risk, he said. Kala's right. Another silence. Then Bram stood, which was the posture of a man who had just made a decision he was going to live with. "I'll get you your rider," he said. He walked away from the fire. Everly looked into it, and in the light of it, her face was still the composed face she had worn for 6 years. But underneath that surface, something had shifted in the architecture. The part of her that had spent 6 years managing a kingdom from inside its walls was making room for the part that was going to have to do it from the outside. She was halfway through composing the message to Chief Wren in her head when Bram came back at a run. He never ran. She could see immediately that he never ran, and he was running. "The Ironhold contact sent a rider ahead," he said. "Didn't wait for our message." Everly got to her feet. "The supply movement you predicted," Bram said. "It's not 30 days out. It's not 30 hours out." He stopped in front of her. His face had the quality of a man delivering something he doesn't want to deliver. "The Aldrich war host crossed into the Ironhold Pass this afternoon," he said. "They're not staging, they're moving, and they're not heading for the corridor." He looked at her directly. "They're heading for Draven's Keep, and they're flying Draven colors." The fire snapped. Somewhere in the dark, the wind moved through the ashwood trees with the sound of something that couldn't stop itself. "Kael opened the gates," Everly said. "He thinks they're allies." She looked at the dirt map still visible at the edge of firelight. She looked at the distances. She looked at what she had and what she didn't have, and who owed her what and how much time there was. There wasn't enough time. She already knew that. She moved anyway. She moved and the camp moved with her. Not because she commanded it. She had no authority here, no title, nothing but the clarity of her read on the situation and the 40 seconds she spent laying it out for Bram and Calla in flat, precise language while people around them were already pulling on gear and kicking dirt over fires. The coalition camp had the specific discipline of people who had practiced emergency dispersal enough times that it had stopped being panic and become procedure. She noted that and filed it as useful. "We cannot reach the keep before they do," Calla said. It wasn't an objection. It was a coordinate. "We don't need to reach it before they do," Everly said. "We need to reach Wren before the Aldrich host cuts the northern route. If Greywood commits, we have 1,100 wolves who can move along the timber roads without using the main corridor." She looked at Bram. "Your coalition has standing with the Blackfen chiefs, do they?" "Enough to request a meeting, not enough to guarantee one." "Request it, tonight." She was pulling her saddlebags from where someone had stacked them near a supply tent. Her hands worked the straps without her looking at them. "Tell them what's moving through Ironhold. Tell them the Aldrich consolidation plan doesn't stop at the keep. If Thornridge controls the eastern corridor and the palace both, the Blackfen territory is next in line for absorption, and they have enough geographic sense to know it." "You're asking us to go to war," Bram said. She stopped. She looked at him directly. "I'm asking you to decide whether you fight now with options or later without them," she said. "The Aldrich host is in the Ironhold Pass. They're flying Draven colors, which means Kael will open the gates, and when he does, the people inside that palace who aren't part of the conspiracy will have no warning at all, no time, no position." She held Bram's gaze. "Some of those people are wolves who have lived in that kingdom their whole lives. They didn't choose the council's rot. They're not going to get a vote on what happens when the gates open." Bram was quiet for 3 seconds. She'd learned already that 3 seconds was the length of a decision for him. "Calla goes north to Greywood," he said. "I'll take the Blackfen message myself." He looked at Everly. "And you?" "I go to the keep." The silence around that was sharp. "The erasure order," Calla started, "is already issued. Going back doesn't make it worse." Everly slung the saddlebags. "I have to know what I'm walking into before I can tell 11 packs what they're agreeing to fight for. I have a contact inside the wall if Drast is still alive, and if he's not, I have 6 years of knowing where every secondary entrance and back passage in that palace is." She looked at both of them. "Get me a fast horse and get the messages out. We have maybe 14 hours." She rode alone. She'd expected an argument about that and hadn't gotten one, which said something about how Calla and Bram processed information. They were operators, not sentimentalists, and operators understood that solo movement through compromised territory was sometimes faster and quieter than accompanied movement, especially when the solo mover knew the terrain. Everly knew this terrain. She'd ridden these roads in every season, in daylight and dark, during border emergencies and routine patrols. The eastern approach to Draven's Keep was 8 hours at a controlled pace, and she didn't have 8 hours, so she pushed the horse harder than she liked to push horses, and she watched the road and thought. The Aldrich host flying Draven colors. That was the part that kept returning to her, not because it was surprising. Deception at that scale required that kind of preparation, flags and livery and the whole theater of legitimate arrival. But because of what it meant Sarah had given Kael. Something convincing enough to make him display Draven colors on behalf of the man who was coming to destroy him. Something that had replaced Kael's judgment with a story he believed completely. She thought about what she knew of Kael's psychology, the architecture of his certainties and his blind spots. He was a dominant alpha who had never been genuinely threatened from within. External threats he processed brilliantly, with the kind of tactical instinct that had won him 3 border conflicts in 10 years. Internal threats were different. They arrived as feelings rather than facts, as social texture rather than military signal, and Kael had spent his entire adult life treating social texture as the domain of his Luna, and therefore not requiring his direct attention. He had outsourced his interior intelligence to her for 6 years, and then he had thrown her out and replaced that function with nothing, or worse than nothing, with people who were actively feeding him a false picture. She wasn't writing back to save him. She needed to be clear about that in herself. She was writing back because the information inside that palace was the difference between the coalition's response being surgical and it being a blind charge into the dark, and because whatever Drast had managed to preserve before they silenced him might be the only leverage she had when the time came to expose the Aldrich faction before the assembled packs. She told herself this 3 times. It stayed true. It didn't stop the other thing from being true alongside it, the inconvenient and useless fact of what 6 years meant even after they were finished, but she had long practice at holding contradictions without letting them steer. She reached the outer walls at the hour before dawn. The postern gate was shut, which it hadn't been in 6 years of her tenure. She had stood against the keep's tradition of closing the servant gates at night because it slowed emergency response and created a population of people who had to violate procedure just to do their jobs. The gate being shut meant someone had reversed that policy, which meant either Kael had finally listened to the security hawks on his war council or the war council had made the decision themselves. She sat on her horse at the edge of the outer tree line and looked at the wall for a long time. The Aldrich host was not here yet. She could feel the absence of that kind of force, 40 miles out, maybe less. The particular pressure that a large armed movement put on the air. They had hours, not many. She found the drainage culvert that ran under the western wall, the one that the official records listed as sealed following the incident with the rogue beta 2 years ago. She had ordered it sealed. She had also, acting on the specific paranoia of a woman who understood that sealed meant sealed in records rather than sealed in fact, ensured that the seal was one that could be removed from the outside by someone who knew exactly where to press. She left the horse tethered in the trees. She went through the culvert on her hands and knees in the dark, and she came up inside the wall in the maintenance yard behind the kitchens, and she stood in the pre-dawn shadows of a place that had been her home and felt none of the feelings she might have expected to feel. Drast's chambers were in the old wing, the eastern corridor of the keep's second level that nobody used for primary quarters anymore because it was cold in winter and understaffed and the windows faced the wrong direction. He'd been there for 20 years. Everly had thought, in her early years, that this was eccentricity. She understood now it was strategy. The man who lived in the overlooked rooms was the man who watched the overlooked movements. The corridor was empty. Too empty. She moved through it with her blade out and her breathing controlled and every nerve reading the building around her the way you read territory, for wrongness, for the specific quality of quiet that was held rather than natural. She found Drast's door unlocked. She found Drast inside. He was alive. He was in the chair by the cold fireplace with his hands folded in his lap, and he was alive but barely. She could see that immediately, the colorlessness of his face, the way his breathing was working harder than it should for a man sitting still. They'd gotten to him. They hadn't finished the job, which told her they'd been interrupted or they'd intended him to survive long enough to be useful. His eyes were open when she came through the door. They found her face. "I thought you'd come," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. Took longer than I calculated. I had to borrow a horse. She crouched in front of him. What did they do? Something in the food. 2 days ago. They're not finished yet. They want to question me first. He paused to let a shallow breath stabilize. There's a document in the floor panel under the left rear chair leg. I need you to take it. She moved the chair without asking. The panel came up. Inside was a sealed courier tube, the kind used for official correspondence, and inside that she found what she'd been writing through the night toward, Drast's record. 30 pages in his careful hand. Names, dates, transactions, the correspondence chain between the Aldrich pack and the council members who had sold the kingdom's interior for the promise of positions in whatever structure replaced it. 8 months of documentation that the old man had built the way he built everything, quietly, completely, with the patience of someone who understood that the record only mattered if you lived to present it. She looked at it for a moment. 30 pages of the architecture of betrayal, rendered in ink that smelled of Drast's office, of the cold eastern wing, of everything he'd spent his career protecting by compromising. Farron and Cassian, she said, reading the top names in the correspondence chain. You knew. I knew when it started. I thought I could correct it internally. His jaw tightened. I was wrong. Drast. I know. He held her gaze. I know what that cost. Say it if you need to. She didn't need to. What he'd allowed had been a failure of nerve, the specific moral collapse of a man who believed he could manage a catastrophe by monitoring it rather than exposing it, and people had been harmed by that, Everly among them. But the man in front of her already knew it and was carrying it in a way that wasn't performative, and she had no energy to spend on making him feel worse than he already did. The host reaches us by mid-morning, she said. I need to know what Kyle believes. What did they tell him? Drast exhaled. They told him the Aldrich host is a military escort, Rowan Aldrich presenting himself and his forces as a loyalty gesture, a show of allied strength. His eyes were steady. They told Kyle that the border packs were planning a coordinated uprising and that Thornridge was the only external force willing to commit troops to defend the keep. So he's expecting allies. He's expecting salvation. He's been managed into a position of total dependence on external validation, and then the only validation offered was Thornridge. Drast's hands tightened in his lap. He's not a stupid man, Everly. He's a man who's been very carefully made to feel stupid until he stopped trusting his own reads. That's a different thing. She sat back on her heels. The document tube was cold in her hand. She thought about Kyle on the festival dais, the look in his eyes when she'd spoken, the rage that had arrived too fast and too total to be purely in response to what she'd done in that moment. Rage that arrived that fast had been building somewhere, being stoked by something. She had read it as arrogance. It had been something closer to cornered. A man who had been managed into not trusting himself would look like arrogance from the outside. The contempt, the dismissal, the explosive response to anything that felt like a challenge to his judgment. All of it could be symptoms of a psychology that had been worked on. This did not make what he'd done to her forgivable. It made it explicable. Those were not the same thing. Is he in the main hall? She asked. As of last night, Farron and Cassian will be nearby. They've been staying close to him since the festival. They'll want to control what he sees when the host arrives. She stood. She was thinking about distances again, about timing, about the gap between what the document in her hand could do and what it needed witnesses to do. The record was evidence. Evidence without a platform was a paper in a cylinder. She needed the host inside the walls, needed the betrayal visible, needed the court assembled to see what the council had done in its name, because a coup that was exposed before it could complete lost its legitimacy, and legitimacy was the only thing the Aldrich faction had left once their military staging was visible to every pack chief who had ridden into that courtyard believing they were attending a show of allied strength. It was a terrible plan in the sense that it required her to let the invasion begin before she moved to stop it. It was the only plan that worked. I need to get to the main hall without Farron or Cassian seeing me, she said. There is a way, Drast said. The passage behind the war room annex. It lets out near the dais antechamber. He paused. I haven't been able to use it,
But you know where it is. I know where it is. She moved toward the door. She stopped. Drast. She turned back. Can you walk? He considered his own body with the pragmatic assessment of an old man who had been surviving longer than anyone expected. Not well, he said. Well enough. Then get up, she said. You're not staying here to be questioned. She moved him through the passage with her shoulder under his arm, which was slower than she'd planned and louder than she'd wanted, and somewhere in that slow transit through the cold back corridors of Draven's Keep, she became aware of something changing in the building around them. A pressure shift, a new quality in the air, the kind of collective body tension that moved through stone and mortar from large numbers of people reacting to something. The host had arrived. She heard the gates, not the sound of them opening. The gates were too far and too heavy for that, but the sound of the courtyard responding, the drums beginning the formal welcome cadence, the movement of people organizing into the reception posture. She moved faster. Drast kept up. They reached the antechamber behind the dais, and she pressed them both against the wall inside it and listened through the door. She could hear the main hall clearly from here. Voices. The particular resonance of a large formal space with several hundred people in it. The welcome was in progress. The performance of Allied arrival was running exactly on script. Then she heard Kael's voice. She had not heard his voice in 2 days. It hit her the way things hit you that you've tried to prepare for and discovered you couldn't quite, not emotionally, which she'd managed, but somatically, in the body's involuntary recognition of something it had organized itself around for 6 years. He was speaking the formal greeting of host to honored guest. His voice was controlled, confident. She could hear in it the specific texture of a man who had decided he was making a strong move and was performing that certainty. And then, through the same door, she heard another voice respond. Rowan Aldrich. Older, rougher, the voice of a man who had spent decades doing exactly what he intended to do and had learned to let that intention show because showing it had never cost him anything. The response wasn't the formal answer of an honored guest. It was something else. Shorter, with an edge in it that the formal script didn't account for. She felt Drast stiffen against her shoulder, and then she heard what she hadn't planned for. Hadn't planned for because she'd miscalculated the one variable she'd thought she had accounted for. The sound of Kael's guards being disarmed was not loud. It was the efficient sound of a professional operation that had been rehearsed, the particular brevity of people who knew how to do something quickly enough that resistance wasn't possible before it was over. 3 seconds at most. Then silence of the specific kind that follows a shift in who holds the room. She pressed her ear to the door. Rowan Aldrich's voice, calm as stone. Alpha King Draven, I'd recommend not reaching for the throne arm. It's going to be a long morning and I need you focused. And Kael's voice. And this was the part that went through her like a cold wire, because it was not the voice of the arrogant Alpha who had stripped her title on the festival dais. It was something raw and entirely unperformed. What is this? Not a question. The words of a man whose picture of the world had just been replaced by a different picture, in public, in front of his court, with no warning and no exit. This, Rowan Aldrich said, is the conclusion of 8 months of patience. Everly looked at the door in front of her. On the other side of it was the main hall of Draven's Keep, with several hundred witnesses and an Alpha King who had just understood, in the worst possible way and at the worst possible moment, that every choice he'd made for the past year had been someone else's architecture. She looked at the document cylinder in her hand. She looked at Drast. She had 2 options, and she understood both of them completely. She could move now, through that door, into that hall, with the record in her hand and whatever authority 6 years had built in the people assembled in that room. It was too soon. The coalition wasn't in position. Greywood hadn't committed. The Blackfen message hadn't landed yet. If she moved now, she was one woman with a document against an armed host inside a closed wall, and the math didn't work. Or she could wait. Let it play out further. Let the hall see more of what had been done to it. Build the witness testimony deeper into the record. And while she waited, Kael Draven was going to sit in that room and take whatever Rowan Aldrich chose to give him, without knowing that the woman he'd sent into exile was 15 feet away, holding the evidence that could end it. The door was cold under her hand.
She had believed coming here that she knew exactly what she was. She had built that knowledge carefully over 6 years and rebuilt it in the 2 days since the festival with even more deliberate care. She had been clear about what she was writing back for and what she was not writing back for, and the line between those two things had seemed, in the dark, on the road, with the logic of it all running clean, very clear. Standing here, listening to Kael's voice on the other side of a door, she understood that clean lines were a thing you built in the absence of the actual moment. In the actual moment, there was only what you did, and what you did was who you became. And there was no version of herself that could stand in this corridor and wait while that room did what it was about to do and remain the person she believed she was. She had not come back to save him. But she was going through the door. She went through the door. The main hall hit her like a physical thing. The heat of it, the noise compressed into sudden silence when the door opened, the smell of several hundred bodies in a closed space that had just shifted from ceremony to something else entirely. Her eyes moved before anything else did, cataloging in the half-second before she was seen. Rowan Aldrich at the center of the dais with 4 armed men bracketing him, Kael standing 3 feet from his own throne with his hands visible and no weapon, Farron and Cassian positioned at the hall's flanks with the particular stillness of people who had rehearsed their positions. The court pressed back against the walls in the instinctive geometry of people who understood they were no longer the point of the room. She saw all of it in the time it took to clear the doorway. Then she was seen. Farron moved first. She caught it in her peripheral vision, the hand signal he sent to the 2 men nearest the dais antechamber door. She was already cutting left, away from the direct line, putting a stone pillar between herself and the nearest armed body before the signal completed. The document cylinder was inside her coat. Her blade was out. Rowan Aldrich's voice filled the hall without effort, the voice of a man who had owned rooms for 40 years. "Luna Everly," he said. "Former Luna. I'd heard you were dead." "You heard wrong." She kept moving, using the pillar and then the next one, the colonnade along the hall's eastern edge that she had walked 1,000 times and knew the spacing of without looking. The 2 men following her were good, but they were operating in her building, and that was a different kind of disadvantage than it appeared. Kael's eyes found her across the hall. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, long enough to confirm he was physically intact, long enough to see the state of him. He looked like a man who had been running on false certainty for 8 months, and had the certainty removed 3 minutes ago, stripped down to something raw underneath. She had never seen him look like that. She didn't have time to account for it. She got to the eastern gallery steps before the first of Aldrich's men reached her. He was fast and he knew how to close distance, but he telegraphed the reach and she'd been watching for it, and she took the impact on her left forearm instead of her center and used his momentum to put him into the gallery rail. The rail held. He didn't. He went down the 4 steps hard and stayed down. The hall was noise again, the compressed, chaotic noise of a crowd that had passed the threshold of paralysis into panic, people moving toward exits that the Aldrich soldiers were blocking, a sound building in the stone that was less shouting than it was the physical pressure of several hundred people discovering they were trapped. Everly reached the gallery and ran it. The gallery ran the full length of the hall's eastern side, 15 feet above the floor, accessed from both ends by stairs that the Aldrich soldiers were now covering below. She ran it to the midpoint and stopped at the gallery rail and looked down at the hall and raised her voice to the register she used when she needed to carry over noise without screaming, the register she'd developed over 6 years of addressing assemblies in difficult conditions. "Every pack chief and ambassador in this hall," she said. "Look at the men guarding the exits." The noise didn't stop, but there was a quality that entered it, attention, the beginning of orientation toward a voice that sounded like it knew something. "Look at their insignia," she said. "Look at the left shoulder, Draven colors on top, Thornridge underneath." She held the gallery rail and let her voice do what it was built to do. "You were told this was an allied host. Count the weapons pointed inward." Rowan Aldrich's voice cut across hers. "Remove her from that gallery." "The council members who arranged this are named in a document I am holding," Everly said. 8 months of correspondence, transaction records, the names of every person in this kingdom who sold it for a position in what comes after. She pulled the cylinder from her coat and held it up. "Farron, Cassian, 3 others whose names are in this record. She watched it move through the hall, the heads turning, the recalibration, the specific ripple of people connecting information they'd had separately into a shape they hadn't seen yet. Farron moved. She'd expected him to. He was 40 yards away and had 2 men with him, and he made the calculation that speed was better than waiting, which was the right calculation, which was why she was already moving along the gallery before he reached the stairs. She threw the cylinder. Not randomly. She'd already identified her target, a Greywood chief she recognized by his northern furs standing near the hall's center pillar. Chief Wren's second, a stocky beta named Aldous, who had sat across from her in 2 days of timber negotiations, and who she had correctly assessed as a man who caught what was thrown at him. She watched him catch it. She watched him look at it, and then look at her, and then hold it against his chest with both arms, in the specific posture of a man who understood he was holding something important and intended to keep holding it. Then Farron's man hit her from behind. The impact took her off her feet. She went over the gallery rail. 15 feet was not a distance you survived by luck. She survived it by the specific unglamorous fact of having spent 2 years training with a blackfen instructor who believed that how you fell was as important as how you fought. She got one hand on the rail on the way down, and it broke the rotation enough that she landed wrong, but not catastrophically. Left side, hip and shoulder absorbing most of it, the impact running up through her body like a bell being struck. She hit the hall floor and didn't move for a second that felt much longer. The air was gone. She'd trained for that too. The body's panicked response to impact-expelled breath, the way it could freeze you if you let it. She didn't let it. She rolled. She got her feet under her. She came up with the blade still in her hand because she'd closed her fist on it when she went over the rail and hadn't opened it since. The hall was looking at her. All of it. Even Rowan Aldrich. She was bleeding from the impact. She could feel it at her hip, hot and continuous, not arterial but significant. Her left shoulder was grinding in a way it hadn't been grinding before. She breathed through both of these things and held the blade level and looked across the hall at Rowan Aldrich and kept her face the face she'd learned to keep. Nothing you weren't already seeing. "You're going to stand there and bleed," Aldrich said, and his tone had changed. The flat performance of earlier replaced by something harder and more direct. The voice of a man who'd just had a plan disrupted by a variable he'd assessed as eliminated. "One woman with a knife." "One woman," she said, "who spent 6 years learning where every exit in this building is, where every alliance in this territory has its fracture points, and who is currently standing in a hall full of pack chiefs who just watched your men trap them." She felt the blood running down her hip and didn't look at it. "Ask them if they feel like allies right now." Aldrich moved his eyes across the hall. She watched him make the read. He was smart. She'd never made the mistake of thinking he wasn't. And smart people made accurate reads even when the accuracy was inconvenient. The pack chiefs were not performing neutrality anymore. The Greywood second had the document cylinder. The Blackfen delegation chief, a woman named Aura, who Everly had met twice and assessed as someone who made decisions in real time rather than from prepared positions, had moved herself against the hall's western wall in the specific geometry of someone who was no longer accepting the room's prescribed structure. Aldrich raised his hand. A signal to his men. They moved toward the pack chiefs. What happened next was not organized. It was the thing that happened when you put trained wolves in an enclosed space and gave them a clear enough target. Not strategy, just the fundamental physics of dominant predators who had been patient long enough and had now received permission to stop being patient. The Blackfen chief moved first, and the rest followed in the organic cascade of a group that had just found its consensus. The hall became chaos. Everly moved through it toward Kyle. She had to cover 40 feet of a room that was currently a collision of bodies, and she did it by moving in the gaps rather than through the density, by reading the flow of the violence the way she'd read the flow of the festival crowd 3 days ago, as a system with patterns, as a space with openings, if you knew how to see them. Her hips screamed. She moved. She reached Kyle as the 2 remaining Aldrich guards who'd been bracketing him turned toward the chaos in the hall. She grabbed his arm. He looked at her. She had prepared herself, in the time she'd had, for several versions of what this moment might be. She had not fully prepared for the specific quality of what she found in his face. Not the arrogance, not the coldness, not the explosive rage of the festival dais. Something much older than any of those things. The face of a man who was standing in the ruins of his own judgment and understood exactly how the ruins had been built. "Everly," he said, and her name in his mouth had a texture she hadn't heard in a very long time. "Not now," she said. "Move." She pulled him toward the colonnade and he moved. No resistance, no challenge, just the immediate compliance of a man who had run out of certainty in every direction except the one person currently pulling him toward cover. They reached the colonnade as the first of the outer wall alarms went off. She heard it, and her chest did something involuntary. The alarm pattern was the outer north wall. Not breach prevention, not attack incoming. It was the pattern for gate acknowledgement. Someone outside the wall was responding to a coalition signal. Calla had reached Greywood. Everly looked at the hall. Aldrich's host was disciplined, but they hadn't anticipated a room full of pack chiefs deciding simultaneously that compliance wasn't in their interest. And the math had shifted in the last 90 seconds from an armed force controlling a passive crowd to an armed force managing active resistance from people who were very good at being dangerous. Not one yet. Not even close. But different from what it had been. She looked at Kyle. He was watching the hall with the focused expression of a combat mind processing current terrain, 6 years of softening stripped away by 3 minutes of visceral reality. "How many of your personal guard are still loyal?" she said. 6, maybe 8. They were separated when Aldrich's men moved. Where? War room. They'd have fallen back to the war room. She thought about the passage behind the war room annex, the passage she'd used to enter the building, the passage that came out near the dais antechamber, which was currently behind Aldrich's primary position. "There's a way to reach them that doesn't cross the open hall," she said. He looked at her. She watched something move behind his eyes, the beginning of a question that was not tactical, something personal and poorly timed, and she saw him recognize the timing and close it down. "Show me," he said. The passage was worse on the return, darker, lower, and she was bleeding seriously now, the hip wound talking to her in the specific language of injuries that were planning to become relevant, whether she acknowledged them or not. Drast was where she'd left him, still in the chair, and his eyes moved to Kyle when they came through, and the quality of that look was everything. The old man who had watched the kingdom rot because he'd believed he could manage the rot, looking at the king who'd rotted because he'd believed his managers. Kyle looked at Drast and said nothing for 3 seconds. "Your document," he finally said. "How long?" 8 months, Drast said. Another 3 seconds. "Get him up," Kale said to Everly. "He comes with us." They moved. The war room was occupied. Her read had been right. 7 of Kyle's personal guard backed against the far wall, holding position the way well-trained wolves held position when the situation was unclear and the order to move hadn't arrived. They saw Kyle, and the change in the room was immediate and total, the recalibration from waiting to active, from uncertainty to function. Everly didn't wait for the reunion. She moved to the war room's map table and pulled the kingdom map and looked at what she knew. The Greywood response coming from the north, the Blackfen still uncommitted but disrupted, the hall in active chaos, Aldrich's host concentrated in and around the main courtyard. 7 guards. Herself. Kale. The outer north alarm had sounded twice more since the first. Coalition signal. Which meant Calla's force wasn't just approaching, it was staging. Which meant someone had to open the postern gates in the next 20 minutes, or the coalition would be fighting through the outer wall instead of fighting with what was inside it. "The postern gates," she said without turning around. "West and north. They need to be opened from the inside." Silence behind her. She turned. Kale was looking at her across the map table. His guards were looking at him. There was something in the room that was not yet decided, the specific gravity of a moment where the person with the authority had to demonstrate what kind of authority it was going to be from here forward. "2 teams, Kyle said. His voice was back to the command register, but different in texture, stripped of the performance she'd heard in it for the last year, something plainer underneath. "Halverson, you take 3 men to the west postern, I take the north. The north passage runs through the outer courtyard," Halverson said. "Aldrich has men there." "I know where my own courtyard is." Kale moved toward the door. He stopped. He looked at Everly. The hall. The chiefs. You gave them something to hold. Aldous of Greywood has the document. Can he hold it? He held a timber negotiation position for 2 days against 3 of your council members, she said. He can hold a document. Something moved across Kael's face. Not a smile. Nothing that simple. The specific expression of a person receiving information about the world they'd been missing. Stay close, he said. She almost said she wasn't there to stay close to him. She almost said she was there for the gates and the coalition and the record, not for him, that the architecture of her return had nothing to do with the man in front of her. She had the sentence ready. She moved instead. The outer courtyard was held by 12 of Aldrich's men who had posted at the structural points, the well, the supply depot, the passage mouth, in the disciplined geometry of people who had been given positions and expected to keep them. 12 against 8 was odds that didn't favor them, and Kael understood this, but the gates had to open, and the coalition was on the other side of the wall, and the math on waiting was worse than the math on moving. She fought on her bad side, and it cost her. The first exchange took a slash across her already damaged shoulder that made her vision go white for a half second. Pure white. The specific absence of sensory input that happened when pain hit the threshold where the body considered shutting down the less essential systems. She didn't let it. She came back to the courtyard through the white with her blade in position and her feet on the ground and the specific narrow focus that wasn't bravery. She had never thought of what she did as bravery. But was the thing underneath bravery, the commitment to staying functional, because functional was the only state in which anything useful could be done. Kael fought like the alpha he was. Not elegantly, not with the showcase technique of a trained duelist, but with the brutal efficiency of someone who had been in actual life or death situations enough times that the performance impulse had been completely replaced by the survival impulse. She had always known he was physically dangerous. In 6 years of court life, she had watched him suppress it under ceremony. It was not suppressed now. She got to the north postern while he was still engaged with the last 2 Aldrich men in the yard. She got the bar up. She got the gate open. The face on the other side of it was not who she'd expected. Calla was there. She'd expected Calla. But behind Calla, in the torchlight of the outer approach, was a force that was larger than anything the Ashwood Coalition could have assembled in the time available. A lot larger. She looked at Calla. Greywood committed, Calla said, and when Greywood committed, the Blackfin chief sent riders. She paused. Word got ahead of us, Everly. Every pack that's owed the kingdom something and hasn't been paid spent the last 6 years watching. They were ready. She thought about 6 years of negotiations, 6 years of quiet relationship building with chiefs that the palace treated as peripheral. 6 years of the work that hadn't shown up in any official record. How many? She said. Enough, Calla said. Enough to end this tonight. The coalition poured through the gate, and from behind her in the courtyard she heard Kael's voice say her name. Not a command, not the alpha register, just her name in a voice that was breathing hard and had blood in it and was looking at the force coming through the gate she'd opened. She turned. He was standing in the courtyard with the last Aldrich man down and 2 of his guards still functional beside him, and he was looking at what was coming through the postern gate with an expression she had no historical reference for. She had watched this man receive military intelligence, absorb territorial losses, manage crises of scale. She had never watched him understand something that cost him this much to understand. He looked at her. She looked back. The force coming through that gate, he said. You built this. Yes. While you were... He stopped. The sentence didn't have a clean ending, and they both knew it. She didn't fill it for him. She didn't have the energy, and he didn't deserve the kindness. What he was working through was real, and she wasn't going to diminish it, but she also wasn't going to carry it for him. Not tonight, not in this courtyard with blood on her shoulder, and the sound of his kingdom finding its way back to itself through the north gate she'd opened. There's still the hall, she said. Aldrich is still in the hall, and the document needs to be presented before witnesses while the evidence of what happened tonight is still visible. He held her gaze for a moment longer. She saw him making the calculation, not the tactical one, that was simple, but the other one, the one that couldn't be made quickly and wouldn't be resolved tonight. He looked away first. The hall, he said. He moved. She moved with him. They were 20 feet from the main hall's south entrance, the coalition force reorganizing through the courtyard behind them, Kalla's voice cutting through the noise with the practiced authority of a woman who had been running operations in difficult terrain for years, when the doors to the south entrance blew open. Rowan Aldrich came through them with 15 men and a face that had moved past the calculation stage into the specific stillness of a man who had decided that if the structure was going to come down, he was going to bring as much of it with him as he could. His eyes found Everly before they found Kael. "You," he said. "Me," she said. He looked at the force coming through the courtyard gate. He looked at his 15 men. He looked at Kael. She watched him do the math she had already done. The math that said his position was finished, the coup was finished, that the apparatus of 8 months of careful construction had been dismantled in the time it took a woman he'd written off to ride a horse through the night and open a gate. He looked back at Everly. "You have the document," he said. "You have the coalition. You have the hall full of witnesses." His voice was entirely even. "You've already won." "I know," she said. "Then what are you doing here, he said. "What do you want?" She looked at him across 20 feet of torchlit courtyard with the sounds of everything resolving or failing to resolve in every direction, with the blood on her shoulder going cold and the document somewhere in the hall being held by a beta she'd correctly assessed, and the coalition her 6 years of work had built coming through the gates behind her. She was aware of Kael beside her. She was aware of what was in Kael's hands. Nothing, no weapon, and still somehow the heaviest presence in the courtyard. And she understood, in the specific clarity that came from being past exhaustion and past the point where performance was possible, that the question Rowan Aldrich had just asked her was not a tactical question. He was asking her what kind of person she was going to be when she won. He was asking it because the answer was the last variable he hadn't been able to calculate, the one that had disrupted his architecture from the beginning and was disrupting it now. She opened her mouth to answer. From inside the main hall, above the noise of everything, a sound she had not been expecting, had not planned for, had no framework to account for. The sound of Farron's voice raised in the hall's acoustic space, and what it was saying was not surrender, was not exposure, was not the sound of a conspirator whose plan had failed. It was a command, and it was directed at the Aldrich soldiers still holding the hall exits, and what it was commanding them to do turned Everly's blood to cold water, because it was not retreat, and it was not stand down, and it was not any of the options that the math had suggested were available to a losing position. Kael heard it too. She felt him go rigid beside her. She looked at the hall doors, she looked at Aldrich. She looked at the gap between where the coalition was and where the hall was, and calculated how many seconds it would take to cover it. It was not enough seconds. She ran. She hit the hall doors at a dead run, and they gave under her weight, and she came through into smoke. Not fire yet. The fire was coming. She could smell it, the specific acrid quality of something burning that was not meant to burn. Structural material, the old timber beams of the hall's upper gallery catching from what Farron had ordered lit in the storage rooms behind the dais. It was not an accident, and it was not a last stand. It was a erasure. Farron burning the hall meant Farron burning the witnesses, burning the assembly, burning the physical space where the record could be presented, and the coup could be formally exposed before the people who needed to see it. No witnesses, no exposure. No exposure, no legitimacy for what came after. She took all of this in across 3 seconds of moving through the hall's southern entry into a space that had reorganized itself into something between a battle and a collapse. Aldrich's men still held the exits, fewer than before, some of them gone or down from the pack chief's resistance. But the smoke was doing the work that the soldiers couldn't do cleanly, driving people toward the blocked exits, creating the specific human panic that was more dangerous than any armed force because it didn't respond to commands. She looked for Aldous of Greywood. She found him at the hall's center pillar, exactly where she'd last seen him, which told her everything she needed to know about what the man was made of. He still had the document cylinder pressed against his chest. 2 blackfen wolves had positioned themselves beside him without being asked. The organic formation of people who understand that the object matters and the person holding it needs to not be alone. She crossed the hall toward him. The smoke was thickening along the upper register. ceiling level first, then dropping. She had perhaps 12 minutes before the lower level became unbreathable, maybe less. The old timber in the gallery was dry from 2 decades of heated air, and it was going to go fast once it committed. "Get people moving to the west exits," she said when she reached Aldous. She didn't stop moving. "The coalition has the outer courtyard. Tell anyone going out that the north and west posterns are open and held by friendlies." Aldous looked at her shoulder. The blood had soaked through to the outer layer of her coat. His expression registered it and set it aside. "The document," he said. "Hold it until I tell you otherwise." She looked at him directly. "Do not let it out of your hands regardless of what happens in the next 10 minutes. That record is the difference between this being a coup that failed and a coup that never happened in the eyes of every pack in this territory." He understood the distinction. She could see it in the way his arms adjusted. She moved. Boss. Farron was at the dais. She had expected him to run, had built her read of him on the profile of a man who operated through proxies and managed from behind the architecture of other people's authority, the kind of person who was genuinely dangerous in the planning phase and genuinely fragile when the planning failed. She had been mostly right. But Farron had something in his hand that changed the math, and he was pointing it at Drast, who had somehow gotten himself into the main hall, possibly carried by one of Kael's guards, and was sitting against the dais steps with the exhaustion of a man who had used everything he had left to get to the place where things were being decided because there was something he needed to see settled. She stopped. Farron looked at her across 30 feet of smoky hall. He was younger than she'd always thought of him. She had processed him as an abstraction for 6 years, a name in council minutes, and in person he was 35 at most, with the particular angular intensity of someone who had been ambitious for so long that it had restructured his face. "You have the document," he said. "Aldous of Greywood has the document. Then you have nothing that matters." "I have this hall full of witnesses who watched your men trap them," she said. "I have the coalition in the courtyard. I have Calla Vane and 11 packs who came because the outer territories have been watching the council rot for 2 years and were waiting for someone to open a gate." The smoke was at her eye level now at the upper register. She kept her voice level. "You're in a burning building, Farron. Whatever you think this move accomplishes, you're in a burning building." "So are you," he said. "Yes," she said. "I've been in a burning building since the festival. I've gotten used to it." A sound behind her. She didn't turn. She tracked it by the change in Farron's eyes, the recalibration that happened when someone entered a room from a direction you're monitoring. She knew the footstep pattern before she needed to confirm it. Kael moved up beside her. She felt it rather than saw it. The specific gravity of the man, the quality of the air when he was close, 6 years of involuntary physical calibration to his presence that hadn't stopped working just because she'd decided it should. She kept her eyes on Farron. Kael looked at the man who had managed his isolation for 8 months, who had curated his paranoia, fed his worst instincts, quietly sealed off every window that might have let clarity in. His voice when he spoke was entirely flat. "Put it down," he said. Farron looked at him. Something moved in his face. Not fear exactly, but the emotion that lived in the same neighborhood as fear. The specific vertigo of a person who had spent months believing they had full knowledge of a situation, encountering evidence that they did not. "You don't understand what this kingdom needed," Farron said. "What you were. What you'd become." "I understand exactly what I'd become," Kael said. "I had help." Farron's hand moved. Everly was already closing the distance, not toward Farron, but toward Drast, the geometry of the situation making it clear where the actual vector was. And she got between the old man and what Farron had decided to do, and the impact came anyway. Not cleanly, off angle because she'd disrupted the line, and it hit her left side in the place where the shoulder wound ended and introduced itself to the hip wound in a way that made her body lodge a serious formal complaint. She stayed on her feet. She was not entirely sure how. The answer was probably somewhere in the territory of having nothing left that wasn't committed to staying functional, the specific zero reserve state where the body stops negotiating and simply executes on whatever the last instruction was. Her last instruction had been stay between Farron and Drast, and that was where she was. Kyle moved past her. She had seen him fight twice now, and both times it had been efficient and without ceremony, and this time was no different except that it was shorter. Farron had skill, but he was operating on the wrong side of a man who had run out of the particular kind of restraint that civilization required and had not found a replacement for it yet. It ended on the dais steps, Farron down, not dead, breathing hard against the stone with Kael's hand on the back of his collar, in the grip of someone who has decided that holding on is more controlled than the alternative. The smoke was serious now. The upper gallery was burning fully. She could hear it, the specific voice of committed fire, the structural conversation that old wood had with heat when the heat had been going long enough. 12 minutes had been optimistic. "Out," she said, loud, to everyone. "Everyone out! West exits, now!" They moved. People moved when a voice knew what it was doing, when the instruction was clean and came from someone who was still standing when standing was hard. And the hall began emptying with the particular organized desperation of a crowd that had been given a direction to aim its fear. She got dressed up. One of Kael's guards materialized to take the old man's weight, and she let him, because she was not going to be useful to anyone if she went down from blood loss in a burning building. Kael came off the dais with Farron. He looked at her. He looked at the blood. Something moved across his face that he didn't have time for, and that she didn't have time for either. "Move," she said. They moved. The courtyard was cold after the hall, the night air coming down like a correction, and she stood in it for a moment with the sounds of the coalition reorganizing and the injured being accounted for, and the hall burning behind her, throwing orange light across the keep's stone walls. She let the cold air do what it needed to do. Her body was having several conversations with her simultaneously, and she was not ready to have any of them. Calla found her. "Farron and Cassian are in custody," Calla said. "Aldrich's host has stood down. When the coalition came through the gates and Aldrich himself was taken, the command structure dissolved." She looked at Everly's left side. "You need someone to look at that." "In a minute." "Everly." "In a minute, Calla." Calla looked at her with the expression of a woman who had dealt with enough people running on empty to know when insisting was useful and when it wasn't. She stayed close. Aldous of Greywood came through the west exit with the document cylinder intact and held it out to her without a word. She took it. It was warm from being held against his body for the better part of an hour, and she stood there in the courtyard with it in her hands and let the weight of it land. 30 pages, 8 months, the complete architecture of what had almost happened to this kingdom. The specific fragility of a structure that had taken 6 years of quiet work to build, nearly destroyed in the time it took for a man to decide his judgment was more reliable than the person beside him. She didn't open it. She held it and breathed. Then she walked to where Rowan Aldrich was being held under guard by 2 of Calla's coalition wolves, and she stood in front of him and looked at him the way she looked at problems, with clarity, without flinching. He looked back. The calculation in his eyes was finished. What was there now was older and plainer, the face of a man at the far edge of a plan that had failed, sitting with the specific stillness of someone who has stopped moving because there is nowhere left to move to. "You built something," he said. Not a compliment, an acknowledgement. "Yes," she said. "I underestimated the range of it." "Most people do," she said. "They see the title and the position, and they think that's the work. They don't see what the work actually is." He looked at her for a moment. "What happens now?" "Now you answer for what you did, in front of every pack chief in this territory." She kept her voice even. "Your daughter answers separately. The council members who sold their positions answer separately. You don't get to absorb their accountability, and you don't get to distribute yours." Something in his face shifted. Not remorse, she didn't think Rowan Aldrich had the architecture for remorse, but something adjacent to recognition. The look of a man who has met something he genuinely didn't see coming and is processing the implications. She walked away from him. She found Kael at the north wall. He was standing with his back to the courtyard, looking at nothing in particular, which was the posture of a man who needed a moment away from being looked at. She understood the impulse. She had spent a lot of the last 3 days needing moments away from being looked at. She stopped beside him, not close, a foot of space between them that had the weight of a much larger distance. He didn't say anything for a while. She let the silence be what it was. "Drast is stable," he finally said. "The camp medic thinks he'll hold." "Good." Another silence. "The document," he said. "How long have you known?" "That the council was compromised?" 4 months approximately. "That the Aldrich involvement went as deep as it did?" "I confirmed it the night of the festival." She paused. "I went to the correspondence room while the festival was running. That's where I was when you told me I was late." He took that in. She watched his jaw work. "And before that," he said, "the months before, when I was—" He stopped. "When you were being managed," she said, giving him the word he couldn't find. "I should have—" "Yes," she said. She wasn't going to make it easier than it was. She had too much of her own blood on the ground tonight to make it easier than it was. "You should have. There are a lot of things you should have done differently, and you know what they are, and I'm not going to list them." He turned to look at her. His face in the firelight from the burning hall was not the face she'd catalogued over 6 years of court life, the face that had learned to display authority so well that it had eventually stopped displaying much else. This was something underneath that, the face of a man standing in a space he'd cleared by losing everything he'd built inside it. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I know what tonight cost you. I know what all of it cost you." She looked at him. She thought about 6 years. She thought about the scar at her temple he'd never asked about. She thought about the cold stone of the way station in the pre-dawn dark, and the 3 men who'd come to erase her, and the fact that they'd been sent while she was still breathing, while she was still the mother of the land her bloodline carried, while she was still, in every way that mattered, the thing that had kept the kingdom's relationships intact. She thought about Kael standing in this courtyard, understanding, for the first time, the size of what he'd almost thrown away. The anger was still there. It would be there for a long time. But she had carried it for 3 days through exile and violence in a burning building, and she understood something about anger now that she hadn't fully understood when the festival gates closed behind her. That anger held too long stopped being a tool and started being a weight. That the difference between a person who survived a collapse and a person who was defined by it was what they did with the space the collapse left behind. She wasn't ready to forgive him. She wasn't sure she ever would be. Not in the form forgiveness usually took. But she was standing here, and he was standing here, and the kingdom they had both bled for tonight was still standing, and that was not nothing. "I know you're not asking," she said. "Don't ask. Not tonight." He nodded. Once. The specific nod of a man who has received exactly what he deserved and understands that. She looked at the burning hall. The fire was past the point of saving the gallery, but the stone walls would hold. Stone remembered everything. The hall would be rebuilt, and the rebuilding would be done by people who knew what had happened in it, and that knowledge would be in the walls the same way 6 years of her work was in the walls. Invisible, structural, present in everything that didn't fall. "The document goes to the assembled chiefs at first light," she said. "Every pack represented here reads it. Every name in it is read aloud. That is not negotiable, and it is not a conversation." "Agreed," he said. "The conspirators are tried publicly. The sentences are public. There is no internal management of this, no council decision made in private rooms." She looked at him. "The council that comes after this one is not appointed by an Alpha King alone. The outer territories have voice. The coalition packs have representation. That is the condition for their commitment tonight, and it is my condition for—" She stopped. He waited. "For what I did tonight being treated as what it was," she finished. "Not a favor, not a gesture. What I built out there and what I brought back through that gate, that is what this kingdom runs on. It runs on that, or it doesn't run." Something settled in Kael's face, something that had been held in the tensed posture of a man braced against a reckoning he hadn't fully arrived at yet. It released, not into relief, but into the specific gravity of acceptance. The weight of a person who has stopped arguing with the truth and started carrying it instead. "Yes," he said. And then, with the plainness of a man who had lost the habit of performing, "You were always the one who understood what held it together. I knew that. I chose not to know it." She had waited 6 years to hear him say something like that. She had not expected it to feel this quiet. The accounting began at dawn. Everly stood before the assembled chiefs in the outer courtyard, pack representatives from Greywood and Blackfen and the coalition territories, the surviving court members, the ambassadors who had spent a night pressed against a hall wall and emerged with considerably revised perspectives on the kingdom they'd come to observe. She read from Drast's record without commentary, name by name, transaction by transaction, the architecture of the betrayal made visible in its full structure. There was no grandstanding in it. She didn't need grandstanding. The record spoke in Drast's careful hand, and what it said was clear enough that clarity was the only register required. Farron and Cassian stood for it without being able to sit. 3 other council members heard their names and did not have the option of looking away. Rowan Aldrich heard his full accounting read in public for the first time with no intermediary, no filtering, no managed version. His daughter heard hers separately, in the same courtyard, before the same witnesses. Everly did not raise her voice once. Afterward, Kyle addressed the assembled chiefs. She stood 10 feet from him and watched him do it. And what she watched was not the Alpha King performing authority before his court, but a man speaking from a position he had earned exactly nothing of, and understood he had earned nothing of, laying out plainly what he had allowed and what he had failed to see and what he intended to do differently. It was not eloquent. It was not the speech of a man who had prepared for the moment. It was the speech of a man standing in his own ruins and speaking the truth of them because performance had run out of road. She didn't forgive him in that courtyard. She didn't think forgiveness was the right frame for what she was doing. What she was doing was something quieter and more complicated than forgiveness. She was choosing to let the accounting be complete rather than ongoing. She was choosing to let the record be the record rather than carrying it as a wound that kept demanding to be seen. That was not the same as absolution. It was harder than absolution in some ways. It required her to hold both things simultaneously, the real harm and the real choice to stop building a life around it. Kyle surrendered the throne formally 3 days later. The new council structure was ratified by the assembled packs within the week. The months that followed moved at a different pace than anything that had come before them. Slower, more honest somehow, as if the crisis had burned off the layer of performance that court life required and left the actual work visible for the first time. Everly took the leadership of the new alliance structure, not appointed, not inherited, but asked for, by the coalition packs and the border chiefs and the surviving court members who had lived through the night of the burning hall and understood what kind of judgment had been operating in that building. She accepted it because she understood it, and because there was no one else who understood it yet, and because leadership taken from necessity rather than ambition had always been the kind she trusted. The work was hard in the specific ways that real work was hard, not dramatic, not crisis-shaped, but the grinding daily labor of building something that would hold the weight of people's actual lives. Trade routes negotiated honestly. Territorial disputes mediated by representatives who had standing from both sides. The outer territories brought into the structure as partners rather than managed populations. She built it the same way she had built everything, by understanding what actually held things together and tending those things rather than the symbols that represented them. Kyle spent that time in the Eastern Territories, which had taken the worst of the Aldrich incursion's disruption. He rebuilt roads. He helped reconstruct 3 pack settlements that had been stripped for resources during the consolidation effort. He did it without title and without ceremony and without, as far as she could tell, any expectation of credit. She heard about this through the coalition's communication networks, the same way she heard about everything, through the people who were doing the actual work and noticing who showed up for it. She did not see him for several months. She had needed that distance the way you needed distance from something that was still too close to see clearly, and she had taken it without apology. When she did see him, at the first full assembly of the new Alliance Council, in the rebuilt hall of Draven's Keep, it was unremarkable in the way that only genuinely settled things could be unremarkable. He was there as a representative of the Eastern Territory Reconstruction Commission. She was there as the Alliance Chair. They sat across a table and worked through the agenda, and their positions were informed by their different roles, and the argument they had over the Ironhold trade structure lasted 40 minutes, and ended in a compromise that was better than either starting position. Afterward, In the corridor outside the council chamber, he stopped her. She stopped. "The timber contract," he said. "With Greywood. You negotiated the renewal last month." "Yes." "Ren's second told me you gave them better terms than they asked for." "Their timber has been undervalued for 6 years," she said. "I corrected it." He looked at her. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man looking at someone he had authority over, or someone he had lost authority over, or the various complicated versions of those things that their history produced. It was the expression of a person looking at someone they understood, finally, with the clarity that had always been available and had been refused for too long. "You were always going to be this," he said, "with or without the keep, with or without me." She thought about the cold stone corridor behind the way station in the pre-dawn dark, and the culvert under the western wall, and the burning gallery, and the north postern gate opening to show her Callah's face and the force behind it. The force she had built without knowing she was building it, by doing the right work in the right way for 6 years, because she was someone who could not do it any other way. "Yes," she said, "I was." He nodded. The same nod as in the courtyard, receiving exactly what was true without arguing with it. He walked back toward the eastern corridor. She stood for a moment in the hallway of a building that had been almost destroyed and was still standing, because Stone remembered what it held, and the right people had gotten to the gates in time. Then she walked outside. The moon was up. The full kind, the specific white silver of a clear autumn night, the kind that put everything it touched into high relief. The keep's rebuilt towers, the outer wall, the territory beyond it that ran all the way to the Ashwood where a coalition camp had stood and from which an alliance had been built that was still being built. She stood under it without ceremony, just a woman who had been exiled and had come back and had not come back as the same woman who left, which was the only sensible outcome of the things she had survived. You went through what she had gone through and you came out changed or you came out broken, and the difference between those two things was not strength, not toughness, not any of the qualities that got celebrated in the telling. The difference was whether you let the loss be a loss, clean, real, acknowledged, rather than a wound you kept carrying as evidence of someone else's guilt. She had lost a palace. She had lost the version of her life that she had invested 6 years in building. She had lost the marriage she had believed, in some form, in until fairly recently, and she had lost the man she had originally chosen, who had been replaced by someone else before she fully understood the replacement was happening. These were real losses. She was not going to pretend they weren't, but she was standing here, under this moon, in charge of something she had built with her own hands from the ground up, something that had no ceiling she hadn't placed herself, no walls she hadn't chosen, no structure that required her to manage its fractures rather than address them directly. That was not consolation. That was something better than consolation. The wind came down off the northern timber country, carrying the cold and the smell of the season turning, and she breathed it in once and let it out and turned back toward the building where the work was waiting, because the work was always waiting, and she had learned a long time ago that this was not a burden. It was the thing that meant you were still the person doing the building. She went back inside.